Recognition, power, and influence is your birthright, and this podcast shows you how to get there. Welcome to episode number 275. In today's episode, I am breaking down an interview process that I recently did for my company where I interviewed some contractors, and I learned a lot being on the other side of the table, on the receiving end of the best practices that I teach you guys to do when you're interviewing. And I have further evidence that the process that I teach you and the interview style that I teach you works amazingly well when executed properly. So I wanted to break down what that experience was like for me, and hopefully you can take away from it some best practices going forward in your interview process. All right, let's get started. Welcome to Women Changing Leadership. I am your host, Stacy Mayer, and I teach you how to get promoted, get paid, and bring your whole self to the leadership table. I am on a mission to change organizations from the C-suite out, because women are the new face of leadership, and we are doing it on our terms. Hello, corporate badasses. Welcome to another episode of Women Changing Leadership. I am your host, Stacy Mayer, and super excited, as always, to be here with you again this week. I have been waiting to record today's podcast episode because I recently went through a series of interviews for my company as we were onboarding a new person onto Team Badass. And I interviewed many people for a contract role within my business. And I kept telling my existing team how much I was learning, or at least experiencing in real life, everything that I teach my clients to do, or more importantly, to not do in an interview. And it was really fascinating to be on the other side of things and to experience that as the person who was doing the hiring, and hearing all of my theories in practice and what was working and not working. And part of the reason I have held off on recording this episode is because I wanted a little bit of space from the actual people who were interviewing. Hopefully this is constructive feedback, in this episode, but I'm going to be pretty brutally honest. So I didn't want to be a total jerk talking about people. But I do think this information is incredibly valuable, and to hear it from the hiring manager's perspective and why I made the decisions that I made along the way. So here we go. I'm going to tell you about my hiring process in 2025 for adding a new person on my team, what worked, what didn't work, and what I would recommend you to do differently going forward. So the process started out as a normal hiring process where I proactively recruited some people online. I went on LinkedIn looking for people just to directly outreach to. And I also submitted my job description onto a job board for that particular subject matter expertise. So I didn't post on anything like public job boards like Indeed and stuff. This was a small community. And I thought, well, let me start here because I want to see if anybody is interested in the smaller community. And I sort of felt like, as the hiring manager, that I wanted people who were kind of already vetted, right? So I definitely didn't want to get thousands of resumes submitted for this one job. I wanted to get, probably if I could get 20 or 30, that would have actually been really, really great. So that's exactly what I did. I posted on this job board. I ended up getting probably about 30 responses to the job posting within 48 hours. And within that 48 hours, it was very, very clear to me the people who stood out and those who didn't. So I requested, as part of the job application, samples of their work. So there was definitely a work product. I mean, this would be, in your line of work, this would be an individual contributor role. So I wanted to know if I liked their work and if I resonated with their work. So that was definitely one key factor. So automatically, when somebody submitted I wasn't necessarily for this particular job looking at their resume. I was looking more at the portfolio that they submitted and how was that organized and how was that thought through. And if these are their best pieces of work, do they resonate with me at all as a consumer? So that was the first piece. And then of course, they also submitted cover letters and they would tell me a little bit about themselves. And that by far was one of the biggest eye openers. So a lot of people would just send a very generic, hey, I'm interested in this role, something kind of boring, mostly about themselves, right? So what I'm about to tell you was a clear indicator, but they would talk a lot about themselves, but more like their credentials. So sort of rehashing their resume, which is not something that I recommend as your coach, to just rehash your resume on your cover letter. Or they would talk about me, but they would talk about me in sort of this way that was like they Googled me or they looked at my LinkedIn profile and they would say something like, I also have a passion for women in leadership, or I really admire the work that you're doing. It's not that I would discount them by seeing this, but they definitely didn't win any brownie points. I actually could care less about any of that information. So I didn't care if they rehashed their resume. I didn't care if they talked about the amazing work that I did. I didn't care if they said one or two lines and didn't really say much at all. Like none of those things mattered. And so certainly if that's all they did, they didn't make it to the next round of interviews. But here's a couple examples of some things that really stood out to me in the initial application and those people that I pushed through. The first thing was always name dropping. So if there was some real connection or if there was, a company or an industry, something that they worked for that I had heard of, any sort of name dropping really, really helped. Like it would catch my attention and I would say, ooh, and I would spend a couple extra minutes on their resume or on their application. The other thing is there were a couple of people that would talk about themselves in the third person, and this always stood out to me. So they would say something like one woman specifically talked about how she had won some awards and different notoriety and how proud she was of these awards that she had received for her work. And I was like, oh, I totally want to bring her in. So that was something that really tipped me over the edge. And so I'm telling you all of this because I want you to do this right away, right? Think about your cover letter, are you including things that other people say about you, things that you're really, really proud of that are very unique and specific to you? That also happens to tie into women's leadership. Like whatever, you don't have to point out that you love women's leadership as well as me, but you can make a connection by talking about some of the ways that you've challenged yourself as a leader and perhaps been awarded for it. So that was huge. That really stood out to me. Okay, now I narrowed it down and I started scheduling interviews. Now, here's where the fun part comes in. These interviews were so fascinating. And my first criteria for the interviews was I only interviewed women at first. I ended up interviewing men towards the end. But at first, I really wanted to focus on interviewing women. I have an all-female team now, and I really pride myself on giving women opportunities, women first, until proven otherwise, right? So I'm biased, but hey, it's my business. I can do what I want. So I interviewed the women and there was a couple of different things. Some people would overinflate their skill set. So they would come on the interview very, very confidently. Usually these people would charge more money for their services. They would talk about how great they were. They were basically rehashing some of the things I had already read on their resume. And when I would leave that interview, I would put them in the maybe pile pretty quickly because I was like, oh, that person is obviously a subject matter expert. They're obviously good at what they do, but I don't really understand the value that they bring. And I also don't see them as part of my team. Like I didn't connect with them, but I was like, they're valuable. And this is an individual contributor role, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And so I would quickly put them into the maybe pile, right? So they're good at their job. I could trust that maybe, I don't even know if I could trust that they could come in and actually do a good job for me, but I could trust that they could put on a good game face, right? Then there were other people that downplayed their credibility and they would just sort of connect with me. There was one woman in particular, and I absolutely loved this woman so much. I really, really wanted to hire her. And the number one reason, I thought this was kind of funny in retrospect, is that she actually included her MBTI profile in her application. She told me what her MBTI was, and it's the same as mine. And if you can imagine, when I interviewed her, we got along really, really well. And I was like, wow, I really like this woman. Why did I like this woman? Because she's like me. You know, we look, think, act, and talk the same way. This is what happens. And you've probably felt this on an interview that you probably didn't make it to the next round of. And you were like, wow, I really got along with that person and they were really amazing. And then you didn't understand why you didn't make it onto the next round. And I'll tell you right now, the reason that she didn't make it to the next round is because I didn't actually believe in her expertise, right? And not only that, but she related to me so well that she downplayed her expertise. So she spent a lot of time. So this is a very strategic role as well as an individual contributor role. But I really want people to kind of strategize with me as a thought partner. And she would say, well, I don't have a lot of experience in strategy, but I can learn it. And I was listening to her and I was like, you totally have a lot of experience strategically. And a lot of the decisions that you've made in your career and the work that you're doing is incredibly strategic, but yet she thought of herself as not a very strategic person. So I don't know if she was thinking, well, it's better to be honest or not, but I wished that she had owned some of her credibility and strategy on top of relating with me, right? So she did a better job of relating with me, but she didn't do as good of a job at owning her expertise and what she did well. And then there were a couple other anomalies that I thought were really interesting. There was one woman who I interviewed who actually started to give me advice. So she said, I looked at your LinkedIn profile, I looked at your website, and I think you should try this. It was so pointed and so direct. And then I was like, oh, okay. Maybe I kind of agreed with her. Like, certainly she broke up on a flaw in my system, right? Like, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But I definitely didn't want to work with her. There was something incredibly off-putting. It was sort of like, you don't know me to tell me what to do. And I tell my clients this all the time. And I want you to know how important it is not to just go into an interview and start telling them what to do and what you've observed online, because you don't know what their reaction is going to be to that one. Like, I could have been like, I hate that idea, or that's a really great idea. But the problem is that she basically just left it at that. She just told me what to do. She didn't say how she would implement that, how she would change that, how she could help me solve that problem. And quite frankly, she didn't even ask me if the problem that she was mentioning is an actual problem for me. And it wasn't the problem I was hiring for. So it was just sort of an off the cuff observation that she had. And so not only was it a little bit jarring for me to be like, oh, okay, well, thanks for the feedback, unsolicited advice, but also it was off-putting because she didn't put herself in the role of fixing it, and it wasn't a role that I was hiring her for. So it was all very confusing, but I do see people fall into this trap a lot of times where they're like, well, I mean, if I see something, I have to say something, and it's important that I'm bold in these interviews. And then you find yourself talking at the other person, right? So I don't recommend talking at them. I recommend asking really good questions, discussing what you've tried in the past, some of your best practices, give them ideas of how you would solve that problem, but don't give them more problems to solve, if that makes sense. So that was one thing that really stood out to me. There was another thing that happened in terms of the follow-up that I thought was really interesting. So the people who would send me thank you letters afterwards, a lot of people didn't send me thank you letters afterwards. I think that if they were a top candidate, I wouldn't have cared if they sent me a thank you letter or not. I still would have reached out to them. But I think the people who did send me the thank you letters and reiterated something that kind of came up in that conversation or asked me if I was ready for a proposal, at least it put them in the strong maybe category and it made them a little bit more top of mind. Whereas the people who didn't reply at all or send me any sort of thank you just kind of went in the random no pile. Another thing that happened once I started sending out the rejection notices is that, like, one woman in particular asked for feedback, on her interview, which I guess is okay. But you have to remember that if you're the one asking for feedback on the interview, it's always going to be the politically correct version of that feedback. So, I didn't want to tell this woman that I just didn't think she would be good at the job, although I guess that would be honest. I'm like, well, you just weren't very good. And so I didn't make this up, but I told her that, she works with a couple of people that are in the same line of work, like competitors. And because this is a contract role, she is going to have multiple different clients. And I wanted people who had a little bit broader view of the work that they were doing. And she said, "Oh, I didn't realize that that's what you were looking for." And I thought that was interesting because she could have just asked me. But I remember in the interview, she kept talking and bragging about the fact that she worked with a bunch of people who did a similar line of work as me. And I was like, well, I don't necessarily see that as a plus. I'm not threatened by it, but it doesn't seem like a benefit. So be careful when you're fixating on some benefit that you think, oh, they're totally going to see the connection here. And I'm like, I didn't care about the connection, but also even worse, I actually thought it was a detriment. So it was part of the reason that I told her no. But I also didn't think she was very good. And so that's what I really wanted to tell her when she asked for feedback. I was just like, you weren't a very strong candidate. Your writing is terrible. But, hey, I didn't say that. And so keep in mind that when you're asking for feedback, you might get some sort of jarred, wishy-washy version of feedback. You're not going to get that direct, honest feedback because people don't really want to tell you kind of just sucked. But maybe you did, maybe you didn't. And then, so here's where my vulnerability comes in. So I was getting super frustrated with this hiring process because I just wasn't finding the strong candidate that I wanted. And I decided that I was going to go, a different route, maybe repost the job. I had to rethink what some of the criteria was. But I kept coming back to this one application that I received that was actually from a man. And I was like, I was being a little stubborn saying I only wanted to interview women. But now after I've interviewed like 20 different women, I should broaden my scope. So I interviewed this guy and he showed up incredibly confidently. He seemed like a strong expert. He was very relatable in the interview. And he met basically all of the criteria that I was looking for, which is that his writing was good. He was able to relate to me and connect with me. He had an excellent portfolio. He seemed like an expert on paper, right? His CV, his LinkedIn profile, all of those things. And, because it's a contract role, I don't have to vet this person like fully, meaning that, I don't have to get references. It's really just me hiring him. So I was like, you know what? Let's give him a shot. So I said yes to him very, very quickly. And I wish that all of the women who were interviewing with me could have listened to how this interview went and just do that, because I would have much rather hired any of those women than the person that I ended up hiring, because I had to unfortunately let him go 2 weeks into the job because he couldn't deliver and it wasn't a good fit. And so now in retrospect, especially for an individual contributor role, I realized that I need like a testing process and probably have other people interview the person and, have a trial period, which with him, I also had a trial period, which is why it was easy enough to turn the decision around. But it definitely was a wasted effort on both of our parts and kind of set us back a little bit in the process. Another really cool thing that I liked about the follow-ups is that even when I was sending out the rejection letters, a couple of people gave me alternative ways that we could work together. Now, this is really important because I talk a lot about in my interview process about, instead of just saying, "Oh, thank you for your consideration," definitely it's like, don't ask me for feedback on the interview process or what they could have done better. Instead, tell me what else you're working on and some exciting other ways that you might be able to help me. Because you can assume, I mean, at this point, most of the people that I took the time to interview, most of the people that I took the time to write back to them and to let them know that I wasn't going to move forward with their application, especially if it took more than 24 hours. Like if I replied to them within 24 hours, you can probably guess that, I just wasn't that into them. But if it took me more than a couple of days to get back to them for the official rejection, chances are great that I really, really liked them, but they didn't show me enough to hire them, right? And so by them giving me alternative ways that we could work together and continuing to stay in touch, some of the women are still commenting on my LinkedIn, they're still connecting with me. And it's really nice to see their names because I have roles open up all the time, right? My business is constantly in flux. But you know what else? So is every company that you're interviewing for. They all have roles open up all the time at various different levels, or they know somebody who's hiring. And so if you make the basic assumption that they liked you, right, that you belonged, that you were good at the interview, giving them an alternative way to work together is huge. I mean, I had some people that were just like, okay, thanks. And then, of course, like I said, I had some people who inquired and gave me some homework. But the people that stood out to me and those people that I really am still thinking about and will end up working with in some capacity in the future are the ones who replied with alternative ways that we could work together. And I just thought that was really, really key and very, very important when you're continuing to stay connected is that, and I've actually had this happen to my clients, get rejected from a job and then getting hired at that same organization or even for that same leader later on. This is a real thing that happens every single time. So don't take these rejections as in they didn't like me. Take it as they didn't choose me for that opportunity, right? And here are some other ways that we might be able to work together in the future. This was a really interesting way for me to process my interviews. I hope this was useful. And I know this was different than my regular podcast episodes, but I really want you to know that I am walking the talk, that I am going through these practices in real time. And it was incredibly fascinating to me to be on the other side of the table and to say, yes, the process that I teach, the way that I teach interviewing matters. And it really, really works. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Before you go, I have a question for you. Do you know how close you are to your next promotion? Really? Not what your boss has told you, not what you even believe to be true, but have you actually taken the time to sit down, take an assessment, review the 5 categories that it takes to get promoted into senior executive leadership positions and decided where you fall in each category and given yourself a ranking on a scale of 1 to 10 of how close you are to getting your next promotion? Have you done this? Well, now's your chance. If that feels interesting to you and you're like, hey, I want to know exactly how close I might actually be or how far away you might be and what it's going to take to get you even closer, then I invite you to take my promotability quiz. This is a quiz that I put together with practical tips that actually tell you where you're lacking and where you're winning. What are the areas that you actually need to improve and not necessarily what your boss is telling you all the time, so that you can take concrete steps towards landing that next promotion and changing the face of the leadership table. Go to yourpromotabilityscore.com to take your free assessment today. Yourpromotabilityscore.com, and let me know how it goes.